The wall had been broken for 11 years, and no one at Rivenhall Park had thought to mend it, until the morning Clara Winslow found a stranger doing exactly that, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a dead rose cane in his teeth. She had come to the walled garden before breakfast, as she did most mornings, to give Lucy her half-hour of freedom among the gooseberries before the day's lessons began. It was Lucy who saw him first. The girl stopped so abruptly that Clara nearly walked into her and pointed one small gloved finger at the man crouched by the south wall, fitting a stone back into a gap that had gaped there since before Clara had ever set foot on the property. He rose when he heard them. He was tall, and his coat was plain wool rather than livery, and there was soil worked so deeply into the creases of his hands that Clara understood at once he was no visiting gentleman who had wandered in by mistake. He inclined his head to her, the bow of a man who had been taught manners and had chosen, for reasons of his own, to set most of them aside. "You will want to keep the child off the north bed until the lime has set," he said. His voice was low and careful, and entirely without the deference a new hire generally offered a lady of the house, even a lady as reduced in circumstance as Clara. It will not hold her weight yet. She had opened her mouth to ask his name when Mrs. Honora Ashworth's voice came sailing over the wall from the terrace, pitched for an audience of one and carrying, as such voices always did, to an audience of several. "I do not care what Mr. Combe says of him," Honora was telling her son, not troubling to lower her tone, for she had never in Clara's 4 years at Rivenhall troubled to lower it in the garden's presence. "A man who will not give his full name and history is a man with something to hide, and I will not have him near the girl unsupervised. Though I suppose we may set the charity case to watch him, since watching is the only occupation her education has fitted her for." Lucy's small hand found Clara's. The stranger by the wall did not look toward the terrace, and did not look away from Clara either, and something in the stillness of him told her that he had heard every word, and had decided, with visible effort, not to react to it. He bent back to his stone. "He is very rude," Lucy whispered, delighted, the way children are delighted by anything adults consider improper. "He is very quiet," Clara corrected her, and found that the correction was not entirely comfortable to make, because quiet, in her experience of Rivenhall's men, was rarer and stranger than rudeness ever was. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know that the last time this particular stranger had stood inside these walls, he had been called Julian Ashworth, and had been the acknowledged heir to the earldom of Rivenhall, and had fled the estate on a gray October morning 7 years past with a dead brother behind him, and no intention of ever seeing the place again. She did not know, either, what he carried in the left pocket of that plain wool coat, small and hard and worn smooth by 7 years of handling, though she would come to know it well enough before the year turned. What she knew that first morning was only this: the garden had a new undergardener who mended walls the old Earl's steward had let crumble for a decade, who spoke to a governess as though her opinion on lime mortar mattered, and who bore, when Honora Ashworth's voice cut through the hedge, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had decided in advance to survive. Clara took Lucy's hand and led her toward the gooseberries, and did not look back, though she wanted to, and would go on wanting to for the better part of a fortnight before she let herself admit it. Rivenhall Park sat at the eastern edge of the county, 3 days' hard ride from London and a full world removed from it. A gray stone house with 40 rooms and a lake that caught the morning light like poured glass. Clara had come to it 4 years earlier, when her father's small estate had been swallowed by his debts, and she had been left with an education, a morning gown, and no further prospects than the ones a distant connection to the Ashworth family could purchase her. She had been engaged as governess to Lucy, the orphaned daughter of the late Earl's younger son, and had understood within a month that her position in the household was somewhere below the housekeeper and considerably above the boot boy, and that this was precisely where Honora intended it to remain. The old earl had died the previous winter. His heir, by every account Clara had ever been given, had died 7 years before that, or as good as died, having vanished from Rivenhall under circumstances no one discussed above a whisper, and never in front of the child. In his absence, the estate had fallen to the management of Honora, widow of the earl's younger brother, and to her son Silas, who wore his expectation of the title the way other men wore a well-cut coat, comfortably, and without any apparent awareness that it did not yet belong to him. The law required 7 years of silence before a missing man could be presumed dead and his inheritance passed to the next in line. 7 years had very nearly run their course. Clara had heard Silas remark, at dinner not a fortnight past, that the solicitors expected to complete the presumption by Michaelmas, and that Rivenhall would at last have a proper master again, one who intended to stay. She had not thought of the lost heir again until she saw the man at the wall. He came to breakfast in the servants' hall the following morning under the name of Mr. Julian Marsh, hired, old Tobias Combe explained to anyone who asked, on the strength of 2 years' work in the Kew nurseries and a letter of character Mr. Combe himself had found entirely satisfactory, though he would not say from whom. He kept to the gardens and the glass-house, and spoke to the other men only as much as courtesy required, and within a week had repaired more of the walled garden's long neglect than the estate's previous 3 under-gardeners combined had managed in as many years. Clara watched him from a careful distance, the way she watched most things at Rivenhall. From a careful distance, having learned early that a governess who watched too openly invited exactly the kind of remark Honora had made across the hedge. Yet she could not help noticing that he moved through the garden the way a man moves through a house he has lived in as a child, without needing to look for the gate, without needing to ask where the well was, and she filed the observation away with the small collection of things about Rivenhall that did not quite add together, and went back to Lucy's lessons, and told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. It would be a great many months before she understood how far from nothing it was, but even that first week, some old instinct in her, the one that had watched her father's creditors come and go with their false smiles, told her that the man at the wall was mending more than stone. The witnessing came 3 weeks later, on a wet Tuesday when Clara had least expected to be seen doing anything worth witnessing at all. Old Mrs. Pruitt, who had been laundress at Rivenhall since before Clara's own birth, had taken a fall on the stairs to the drying yard and lay for the better part of an hour before anyone found her, her hip badly wrenched and her mind wandering with the pain. The house's proper physician had been sent for from town, a journey of 2 hours in fair weather, and rather more in rain. And in the interval it was Clara who sat on the cold stone floor of the laundry with the old woman's head in her lap, holding her hand and speaking to her in the low, steady voice she used for Lucy's worst nightmares, while the rest of the household found reasons to be elsewhere. She did not know that the new under-gardener had come in from the wet with an armful of kindling for the laundry fire, and had stopped in the doorway rather than announce himself, and had stayed there a full quarter of an hour, watching a governess who owed the laundress nothing, and would gain nothing by the kindness, hold a dying woman's hand, as though it were the only task in the world worth doing. Mrs. Pruitt did not die that day, though it was a near thing, and when the physician finally came, he said plainly that another hour on the cold stone might have finished her. Clara thought little more of it. She had done what anyone would do, she told herself, and went back to Lucy's Latin declensions with damp knees and a cold that lingered a week. She did not know that Julian Marsh had gone that same evening to the small room above the glass house where he slept, and taken from his coat pocket a small carved wooden robin, worn smooth along one wing where a thumb had rubbed it 1,000 times, and turned it over in his hands for a long while before he set it back in his pocket, closer to his heart than habit required. The robin had been carved for him by his younger brother Thomas, in the last summer either of them had spent at Rivenhall as boys, whittled from a fallen branch of the very oak that stood by the lake's north bank. Thomas had been 12 that summer, quick and fearless and entirely too fond of the water, and Julian, 19 and newly given charge of him for an August afternoon while their father rode to town, had let him wade too far past the shallows chasing a heron's shadow. He had not seen it happen. That was the wound that never healed cleanly, that he had not seen it happen, that he had been reading on the bank with his back half turned, and that by the time he looked up, there had been only the surface of the lake gone still again, and Thomas nowhere upon it. His father had never once said the word blame aloud. He had not needed to. Grief had rearranged the old Earl's face permanently that autumn, and every glance he afterward turned on his surviving son carried the accusation he would not speak until Julian had understood, at 19, that the kindest thing he could do for a father who could no longer bear the sight of him was to remove the sight entirely. He had left within the month, first for the merchant marine, and then, when the sea proved no cure for what ailed him, for 2 years' hard labor, learning the practical science of growing things at Kew, because it was work that asked nothing of a man's history, and rewarded only what his hands could do in the present hour. He had told himself, in 7 years of practiced silence, that he would never come back. His father's death that winter, reported to him by a solicitor's letter that took 4 months to find him in the Italian nursery grounds, where he had been consulting on rosestock, had changed nothing about that resolve, until the day he learned that his cousin Silas meant to have him declared dead by Michaelmas, and take the title as though Julian had never drawn breath. He had come back, in the end, not to claim anything, but only to see whether the house still stood the way he remembered it, whether the lake still lay the way it had lain the morning Thomas went under, whether there was anything left of the family he had fled that a stranger could still recognize as worth saving. He had told himself he would look and judge and leave again before anyone learned his name. He had not expected to find a governess kneeling on cold stone for a laundress who could do nothing for her in return. A soft word before the story goes on. If a place like Rivenhall has ever asked you to disappear from your own life to spare someone else's comfort, you already understand what Julian carried in that coat pocket. Stay with Clara a little longer. What is coming will be worth the waiting. The second voicing of the label came a fortnight after that, in front of a dozen witnesses. At the harvest supper Honora held each September for the tenant families and the neighboring gentry, an occasion she treated with the gravity of a coronation. Clara had been asked to help arrange the long tables in the great barn, a task Honora considered suitably beneath a lady's companion and entirely appropriate to a governess. She was smoothing a linen cloth when Silas Ashworth, flushed with his aunt's good claret and eager to impress Miss Georgiana Fenwick, who sat near him in ice-blue silk with her fortune arranged as visibly as her jewels, gestured toward Clara without troubling to lower his voice. "You must forgive the household's arrangements, Miss Fenwick," he said, to general laughter from the young men around him. "We keep a charity case about the place to see to the child. Miss Winslow has excellent manners for a woman with nothing behind her. One almost forgets her situation, until one is reminded of it." Clara felt the heat come up her throat and did not look up from the cloth. Across the barn, half hidden by a stack of harvest baskets, Julian had come in with a load of squash for the supper tables, and he stopped where he stood, and for one unguarded second something moved behind his composed face that no undergardener had any business showing at the mention of a governess's situation. No one else saw it. Clara, absorbed in her own humiliation, did not see it either. Old Tobias, though, who missed very little that happened in his gardens or out of them, saw it plainly, and said nothing, and went on stacking his baskets with a small private frown that he kept entirely to himself. That night, Walking Lucy back from the barn's last dance, Clara passed the glass house and found Julian standing at its door, ostensibly checking the evening's watering, though the watering can in his hand was, she noticed, entirely dry. "Miss Winslow." He said her name carefully, as though testing whether he had earned the right to it. "Sit down a moment. You are white as the linen you were folding." "I'm quite well, Mr. Marsh." "You are not." It was not unkind, the way he said it, only certain, the certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed in smaller things, because he had long ago given up being obeyed in the larger ones. "Sit. I will fetch you water." She sat because there was nothing in the flat command to argue with, and because some part of her, tired and stung and unused to being looked after by anyone at all, did not want to argue with it. He brought the water himself rather than sending a boy, and stood near while she drank it. Near enough that she was aware of exactly where he stood without needing to look, and said nothing further about Silas Ashworth's remark, though the set of his jaw suggested he had a great deal he was declining to say. "Why do you stay?" he asked instead, "in a house that speaks to you so?" "Where would I go, Mr. Marsh, that would speak to me any better?" She meant it lightly. It did not come out light. A woman without fortune has few doors open to her, and fewer still that open kindly. "I have Lucy. That is enough reason to stay." Something in his face, watching her say it, looked for a moment almost like recognition, as though she had described a country he knew from the inside rather than the outside. He did not explain it. He only nodded once and told her to go in before the night air chilled her further, and watched from the glass-house door until she and Lucy had crossed safely to the house, in the particular way a man watches something he has already decided he cannot afford to want. Autumn deepened, and with it Honora's plans for Michaelmas, when the solicitors would formally declare the missing heir dead, and Silas would step into a title he had spent 7 years rehearsing. Clara noticed in those weeks how often Julian found reason to be near the house, rather than the garden proper, mending a gutter here, clearing a drain there, always within sight of a window that looked out on rooms he never entered. She noticed, too, how the old butler, Mr. Aldous Fenn, who had served the family since before the old Earl's marriage and had lately taken to acting also as the household's man of business, watched the new under-gardener with a stillness that did not belong to a man watching a common hire. She did not yet know that Fenn had been quietly corresponding, on the strength of a resemblance he could not name, but could not dismiss either, with the solicitors handling the Rivenhall estate, nor that a search had been quietly opened for the missing heir the moment word reached London that his death would soon be presumed. She knew only that something in the house was drawing tight, like a rope wound past its slack, and that everyone in it seemed to be waiting for something no one would name aloud. It was Lucy who brought the two threads together, in the artless way children do. She had taken to following Mr. Marsh about the walled garden in the hour before her lessons, charmed by his patience with her endless questions, and one morning she came running to Clara with a prize held out in both hands. "He let me hold it," she said, breathless. "He said it was his brother's. He said his brother made it for him before he drowned." It was the wooden robin, worn smooth along one wing. Clara took it carefully, turned it once in her fingers, and felt something shift and settle inside her that she could not yet put a name to. An unease that had less to do with the object itself than with the sudden certainty that a man who spoke so rarely of himself had told a 7-year-old child something he had told no one else at Rivenhall in 7 years. She returned the robin herself that evening, finding Julian at the lake's edge in the last of the light, standing exactly where, she understood now without being told, his brother had gone under. "Lucy showed me your robin," she said, holding it out. "I am sorry. I did not mean to pry." He took it from her without meeting her eyes, and turned it over once in his own hand before closing his fingers around it. My brother made it the summer he died. I have carried it 7 years and shown it to no one, and this afternoon I gave it to a child I have known a month, because she asked me plainly why I looked sad at the water. And no one at Rivenhall has asked me that plainly in all that time. What happened here, Mr. Marsh? A boy drowned, he said, because his elder brother was reading on the bank instead of watching him. And the elder brother has spent 7 years believing that if he had simply looked up 1 minute sooner, there would be 2 men standing at this lake tonight instead of 1. The wind moved over the water. Clara did not reach for him, though every instinct in her wanted to, understanding as she suddenly did the particular shape of the grief he carried, a grief cousin to her own losses, though larger and older, and never once spoken aloud until this hour. You did not put him in the water, she said quietly. No, he agreed. Yet I was given charge of him, and I failed it. And there is no undoing that with 7 years of gardens in Italy, or 2 years of Kew's glasshouses. I have tried. He did not tell her, that evening, the rest of it, the name he had been born to, or the reason a man with a title waiting for him in London chose instead to mend walls under an assumed name in the county he had fled. Yet something between them had shifted at the lake's edge that neither one attempted to name, and when he walked her back to the house in the dark, his hand hovered near her elbow the whole way without quite closing on it, a nearness that asked nothing and promised nothing, and yet said, more plainly than words, that he had begun to want something he had told himself for 7 years he had no right to want. There was, before Michaelmas, one further evening Clara would remember longer than she expected to. The evening Silas cornered her in the corridor outside the schoolroom, with a bottle of Honora's good claret, already half finished in him, and a proposal on his lips that had nothing honorable in its shape. You need not go on scraping for your bread in this house, he told her, one hand braced against the wall beside her head, near enough that she could smell the wine on him. A man in my position, come Michaelmas, might see a woman like you comfortably settled elsewhere, provided she showed the proper gratitude for it now. Clara kept her spine against the wall and her chin level, having learned over 4 years exactly how to make herself immovable without giving a man the satisfaction of a struggle to enjoy. I would thank you to stand back, Mr. Ashworth. He did not stand back. It was Julian's voice that made him, arriving from the stair landing with a coil of garden twine still looped over one arm, his own tone flat and entirely without heat. The voice of a man who had decided a thing and would not be argued from it. Go inside, Miss Winslow, he said, and though it was phrased as a command to her, his eyes had not left Silas's face since he rounded the corner. Mr. Ashworth and I have a matter of garden boundaries to discuss. There was nothing in the words to object to. There was, in the stillness beneath them, a warning plain enough that even a man 3 glasses into Honora's claret understood it. And Silas straightened and made some remark about gardeners forgetting their place that died half-spoken under the weight of Julian's continued silence, and retreated down the corridor with as much dignity as a retreat allows. Clara did not go inside at once. She stood a moment in the empty corridor with her heart still loud in her ears, and found Julian watching her with an expression he had not troubled to arrange into anything careful. "Thank you," she said. "You have no need to thank me for the ordinary courtesy. Any decent house owes its servants," he said, and something bitter moved under the words. Aimed, she understood, less at her gratitude than at a household that had made such courtesy the exception rather than the rule. "Eat something before you sleep. You have gone without dinner twice this week and think no one has noticed." "You have been counting my meals, Mr. Marsh." "I have been counting a great many things about you," he admitted, and did not explain further. and left her standing in the corridor with her pulse unsteady and a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the season's cold. Michaelmas came with the first hard frost, and with it the household's preparations for a dinner that Honora had planned, quite deliberately, to double as a celebration, the solicitors having confirmed that week that the 7 years' presumption would be formally entered before the county magistrate the following morning, and Silas would, by that time next day, be the Earl of Rivenhall in fact, as well as expectation. It was at that dinner that the third voicing came, and it came, as such things generally do, in the cruelest possible form, second-hand and behind Clara's back, so that she heard of it only after the damage had already spread through the servants' hall like water through a cracked cistern. Mrs. Betsy Combe, the housekeeper and old Tobias's sister, came to Clara's room that night, with her face drawn tight with distress. "You ought to know what's being said below stairs, miss, before it reaches your ears, twisted worse than it already is," Mrs. Ashworth told the housekeeper from Fenwick Court, plain as anything at table, that you'd been seen alone with the new gardener of an evening, more than once, and that a governess, with nothing to recommend her but her manners, had best not forget what a household like this one does with women who forget their place. Charity case, she called you. Same as ever, only crueler this time, on account of Miss Fenwick sitting right there to hear it. Clara sat very still on the edge of her narrow bed, the cold of the room settling into her all at once. She thought of Julian's hand hovering near her elbow at the lake, of the robin turned over in his fingers, of every careful, deniable kindness that had passed between them across the autumn, each one now recast in Honora's telling as something shameful, something that confirmed exactly the low opinion the household had always held of a woman with nothing behind her. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded in the empty room. She sat a long while after Mrs. Combe had gone, the candle burning low, and thought of every small kindness she had ever offered this house in 4 years. The hours spent over Lucy's letters, the nights spent at sickbeds no one else would sit, the countless small dignities she had swallowed rather than cause trouble. None of it had purchased her the smallest measure of protection when Honora decided, over a single dinner, to spend her reputation for the price of a good story. She packed her small trunk with hands that did not shake until she reached the bottom of it. And there, folded inside a shawl her mother had left her, she found the pressed violet Lucy had given her that first autumn. And it was that, more than anything Honora had said, that finally brought the tears. "I know it, miss. Only knowing it and having the house believe it are two different coins, and Mrs. Ashworth's never been shy about which one she'll spend." Word came the following morning, delivered by Fenn himself with a gravity that silenced the breakfast room, that Miss Winslow's services would no longer be required at Rivenhall past the week's end, on grounds Honora described only as a want of the discretion proper to her position. Lucy wept. Clara did not then. Not in front of the household that had already decided what sort of woman she was, but she felt something in her chest go as still and cold as the lake at dawn. The particular stillness of a woman who has been told, not for the first time in her life, that her worth counted for nothing against the comfort of people with more power than she would ever hold. She did not see Julian that day. She did not know that he had gone, white-faced, to find Tobias Combe in the potting shed the moment he heard of her dismissal, and had said to the old man, in a voice with none of the careful flatness he had maintained for a month, that he could not let this stand, that he had let a household mistake his silence for absence once before, and lost a brother to it, and would not lose anything else to it now. "Then stop hiding in my garden, my lord," Tobias had said, the title falling from him plainly, without ceremony, as though he had been waiting 7 years for the chance to say it. "You have mended every wall on this estate, but the one that matters." The magistrate's confirmation was to take place that same afternoon in the Great Hall. Before the assembled tenants and the neighboring families Honora had specifically invited to witness what she had already begun calling, in letters sent that week, the restoration of Rivenhall's proper order. Clara had not intended to attend. She had spent the morning folding what few belongings a governess dismissed without character could carry away with her, and had resolved to be gone before the ceremony began, sparing herself the sight of Silas accepting a title on the strength of her own public disgrace. It was Lucy who would not let her go quietly. The child had planted herself in the hall doorway, tear-streaked and immovable, and declared with the particular fierceness of a 7-year-old certain of her own justice that she would not watch anyone else be sent away from her. Not her uncle, who never came, not her governess, who was the only person besides Mr. Marsh who had ever told her the truth about anything. Clara, unable to move the child and unwilling to make a scene of dragging her, had no choice but to stay, and so she stood at the back of the great hall, half hidden by the tenant families, and watched. The magistrate had nearly finished reading the formal presumption, the dry legal language rendering 7 years of a man's absence into a paragraph and a signature, when the hall's side door opened and Julian walked in, still wearing his gardener's coat, soil under his nails, and crossed the length of the room in a silence that spread outward from him the way cold spreads from an opened window. "I would ask the magistrate to withhold his signature," he said, "on the grounds that the man he is declaring dead is standing in this room." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and disbelieving. Honora's fan stopped its slow motion in her hand. Silas half rose from his chair and sat again, as though his legs had briefly forgotten their purpose. Fenn, standing near the magistrate's table, did not look surprised at all, and Clara understood in that instant that the old butler's quiet correspondence these past weeks had prepared exactly this hour. "I am Julian Ashworth," he said into the silence, "and I have been at Rivenhall a month, under a name that was never mine, watching this house to see whether there was anything left in it worth returning to. I have my proof with Mr. Fenn, who has known my face since I was a boy, and has held his tongue at my own request until I was ready to speak. I am ready now." The magistrate, a careful man unused to drama at his tidy proceedings, called for the proof, and it was produced and examined and confirmed with the particular slow gravity of the law satisfying itself. Silas's face, through the whole of it, moved from disbelief to fury to a kind of gray defeat that Clara, watching from the back of the hall, found she could not entirely enjoy, remembering what Honora had once said of confident people meeting the one room where their confidence failed them. It was Honora who spoke first once the proof was accepted, her voice sharp with the particular fear of a woman watching her whole arranged future collapse in a single afternoon. "This changes nothing regarding the household's proper conduct, my lord, whatever name you choose to answer to. I trust you will agree the governess's dismissal stands. A man of your restored position can hardly wish to be associated with a servant of loose reputation." Julian turned, then, and looked across the hall to where Clara stood half hidden among the tenant families, and something in his face, 7 years guarded and a month more careful still, simply stopped guarding itself. He crossed the room the way he had crossed it a moment before, in 3 long strides that left no doubt of his intention, and stopped before her close enough that the whole hall could see exactly what he meant to do, and took her hand in front of every witness who had ever called her nothing. "She is the woman I choose to be my countess," he said. 12 words, no more, spoken plainly, the way a man speaks a fact rather than a plea. The hall's silence broke into a low current of voices, tenant families murmuring approval, the Fenwick housekeeper's face going carefully blank, Honora's fan dropping altogether from her hand and clattering on the stone floor. Georgiana Fenwick, watching from her seat with an expression that mixed disappointment with a certain relief, said nothing at all, understanding well enough, being a woman raised in the same hard school as Clara, though with a fortune to soften it, exactly which of them the room had just been forced to see clearly for the first time. Clara did not weep in front of them, though her hand trembled where Julian held it, and she did not lower her eyes, though 4 years of Rivenhall had trained her to do exactly that whenever the room's attention turned to her. She looked instead at the man she had known a month as a gardener, and now knew, in the same breath, as an earl, and found that the truth of him had not changed at all between one name and the other, only the world's willingness to see it. "You might have told me," she said, quiet enough that it belonged only to the two of them, though half the hall strained to hear it anyway. "I was afraid," he admitted just as quietly, "that if you knew what I was, you would look at me the way this house has always looked at rank, and I had rather be loved as a gardener a little longer than lost as an earl at all." Honora, recovering some fragment of her composure, attempted one final protest about propriety and precedent, and found her voice fragmenting under the weight of a room no longer inclined to listen to her, the Tennant family's murmur rising just enough to drown the end of her sentence. Fen, with the particular dry satisfaction of a servant who has waited years to see justice done properly, quietly informed her that the dowager's rooms at the eastern end of the house remained perfectly comfortable, and that Mr. Silas's allowance would, of course, continue at a gentleman's rate, though the estate itself now answered to its rightful master. It was, Clara thought, watching Honora absorb the shape of her own diminishment, precisely as much correction as the moment required, and not one measure more. The frost held through the week that followed, and beneath it the walled garden slept the way gardens do before spring, and Julian spent his mornings, as he had all autumn, working the soil with his own hands, though now with the whole household's knowledge of exactly who knelt in the dirt. He asked Clara to walk with him there on the last morning of the old year, past the mended south wall, to the bed where the estate's oldest rose, planted by his grandmother and neglected since his mother's death, had finally, after a season of his patient grafting, put out one late stubborn bloom against all reasonable expectation of frost. "My mother called it the Rivenhall rose," he told her. "I have been trying to bring it back since the week I arrived, before I knew why I was trying. I think I wanted something at this house to survive that I had not ruined." Clara touched the bloom's edge, careful of the thorn. "It survived because someone finally tended it." He took the wooden robin from his pocket, worn smoother now than ever from a month of worried handling, and knelt to set it carefully in the crook of the rose's oldest branch, where it would catch the morning light. "Thomas would have liked this garden better mended than mourned," he said. "I think I understand that now. I did not, for 7 years. Lucy found them there a few minutes later, breathless from running the whole length of the lawn, and declared that Mrs. Combe had said there would be a wedding by spring, and did that mean she might have a new gown, and might Mr. Marsh, who she still could not quite bring herself to call by his proper title, come to watch her practice her Latin every morning the way he always had. Every morning, Julian promised her, and meant it, in the particular voice of a man who had spent 7 years promising himself nothing at all, and had finally, in a walled garden with a mended wall and a stubborn rose, and a woman who had never once cared what name he wore, found something worth the promise. Snow came that night, the first proper fall of the season, and settled soft and white over the garden's mended stone. Over the south wall Julian had first knelt to repair the morning Clara found him there, and over the rose that had refused, against every expectation, to give up its last bloom before the frost took the rest, and over the small wooden robin sitting watch in its branches, exactly where it belonged. Thank you for staying until the end of Clara and Julian's story. If a mended wall, a stubborn rose, or a wooden robin found its way into your own heart tonight, we would be glad to know it.